3. Welcome, everyone, to the 5th episode of Psychepathology and Well-being on the Cognitive Science Show. I'm joined again by Greg Enriquez and Garri Hovannisian, and I'm going to turn things right over to Greg to review what we did last time. And then Garri is going to take center stage today and talk about some recent work that he and I have been doing that's relevant to this whole project that we're undertaking with Greg. So take it away, Greg.
Lovely. Yeah. So we started with some problematizing that John did. And then we handed it over. I took sort of the UTOC frame on well-being. I described the nested model, which is a descriptive framework for thinking about well-being in terms of the subjective experience of being nested in psychological functioning, that's nested in biological functioning. Then that sets the stage for that structure to be nested in the environment, both materially and socially, and then ultimately contained within a normative structure of an evaluator. That afforded us kind of a map, I think, to deproblematize or clarify some key aspects of what goes into well-being. It also set the stage for us to clarify what we mean by psyche, which is sort of this epistemic inside-out vector, and how that might relate to psychology, which is this outside-in sort of scientific vector. And then we inverted that a little bit and started to talk about psychopathology from this perspective, especially when we kind of considered our transjective views, like inside out, outside in, across, and the meta theories that we built together, which then says, hey, what are the transjective agent arena, agent other arena relations that either afford people potential for growth and reciprocal opening and those capacities, or what trap them? I identify a triple negative neurotic loop where individuals get stuck in negative situations, negative feelings that have negative reactions to those that then drive them into dead ends, what I used to call a reciprocal narrowing, that then trap them and afford them limited capacities for adaptive functioning and create kind of all sorts of maladaptive consequences. I see that as really at the heart of the problem of psychotherapy. And now I feel like we're in a position and then structure sort of the character developments, trait aspects, and other kinds of things that then inform that view. And I think Garri's well situated to do that.
Great. Okay, thank you for that. So essentially the part that I want to use there as my access point for proposing my argument is the bit about transjectivity. So we've been discussing, I remember in the first or second episodes, you gave a nice historical overview of the Enlightenment gap and the different kinds of problems that arose from it, especially for the scientific study of the mind. And the core claim, if I were to make one based on all of that, would be that any account of mental well-being or psychopathology that's predicated on the dualistic sort of Cartesian understanding of the mental and the physical, right, is bound to run into the kinds of fallacies that we saw we have to be able to circumvent in our study of the mind and in our explanations of mental well-being and psychopathology. We looked at the different normative fallacies, the equivocation fallacy, right, between what counts as psychologically healthy or unhealthy versus what's psychologically normal or abnormal in the statistical sense, or the equivocation between, again, psychological normativity and social norms and values, as well as biological norms, et cetera, as well as historicity, right? That's another big one. And so if we want to, the argument here is that if we want to produce a good, right, plausible account of mental well-being and psychopathology, we have to do something else than just presuppose these frameworks that we inherited from the time of the Enlightenment. So how are we going to do that? So I want to start with a kind of example, and my typical approach would be to sort of take up the standard argument in the literature and then to demonstrate its weak points and then to let it collapse on its own weight, and then to do the whole academic thing of here's my account and these are all the ways in which it's better. But instead, let's go through anecdotes and some relatable examples. So you're a therapist and a client comes to you and complains about people that the client gets to know that at first the relationships tend to be good and fun and easygoing, but eventually and sooner or later, everybody sort of turns around and leaves. And people grow distant over time and don't seem to be interested in interacting with your client or building a friendship or anything like that. So how do you make sense of this? This is the presenting concern. I don't get why people eventually get distant from me. There's three ways that we can go about this. One of them is by sort of locating the problem in the world, in the people. Oh, you just haven't found the right people. They're the problem, you're okay. And that's a kind of naive, commonsensical way to go about it. If a friend comes to you and says something like this, you might offer him or her these kinds of words that, don't worry about it, you're okay, I know you, it must be them. If you go to a cognitive behavioral therapist, they might do something else. They might actually invert it and say, did you just say people always leave me? Let's look at that absolute claim and then try to undermine it by using logic and reasoning and things like that. And so the presupposition there is that the problem isn't actually in the world, but it's in your thoughts or behaviors. And what we're going to do is restructure, right? Modify your behavioral and cognitive patterns. And that's eventually going to lead to the kinds of consequences that you actually want, presumably. But that too is a little bit naive. It's less naive than the first stance, in my opinion, but it's also still naive because self and world, they're inseparable. It's not the case, at least from the point of view that we're coming at this from, right? It's not the case that whatever problem you're having is caused by conditions, right, that reside exclusively in the world or exclusively in yourself. It's about how you come into relationship with worldly conditions. And there's something about that dynamic that, right, takes the form, the manner of expression that it does, which you then call your suffering. So what we're interested in is that in-between space, that transjective space, not what's going on objectively in the world or in others, let's say, or subjectively in your thoughts, feelings, and whatnot, but how to put these two poles in a fruitful, productive circulation so that you can hermeneutically, right, zero in on the essential dynamic that's bringing about the problem, so to speak. So I noticed that, John, you're wanting to say something. Let me take a step.
I just wanted to buttress or amplify that on something that I'm starting to do more work on. I've done it here and there, bits and pieces, but I want to do it more explicitly, which is the ontology of a problem. What kind of entity is a problem? And you just did so. One of the things, and you can even see this happening in the literature around insight problem solving. There was sort of this realization in 1995, after literally decades of work. Wait, nothing is intrinsically an insight problem. There's no constellation of conditions or patterns of emotion that are intrinsically an insight problem. And that's about as far as they got. But what they didn't take it is, well, that's the case for any problem. Problems don't exist. Like there's nothing that's intrinsically a problem. That doesn't make any sense, right? And as Garri just said, it's right. It's not the case that the problems are just in your head, or it couldn't be the case that your problems could kill you, because they can. If you don't solve certain problems, you die, right? And so they can't be your problems are just in your head. So, right, if you really get into what the ontology of a problem is, it's not in the world, it's not in your head, it's properly, right? It's properly transjective. So I think the ontology of a problem is basically the privation of an affordance. It's a description of the privation of an affordance, and then therefore it's an inherently a transjective thing. And if we take the core of intelligence to be general problem solving, intelligence is therefore inherently a transjective thing based on the ontology of what problems are. And I think that goes exactly to what, so your anecdote, I think, is exemplifying the general features of the ontology of problems. And it's really hard to get people out of both, like, the Stoics are all about the problem isn't in the world, because people like, oh, I got to move the world, right? No, it's in your, but the problem is, no, it's not romantic either. It's not just in your head, right? They're right. And I think it's really surprising if you take a look at it that we have done very little work on the ontology of problems. And like I said, you know, 2.5 decades before Weisberg sort of says, hey, I don't think anything's intrinsically an insight problem. Not everybody's sort of thrown back on their heels, right? It's like, yeah, oh, right, right. But and I want to give the guy credit. That was like, but the fact that there wasn't that people didn't stand back and then say, hey, wait, I don't think problems at all exist in the physics or whatever you want to say, right? And so I just wanted to throw that in as really amplifying what you're saying. I think part of what we need is a phenomenology and ontology of problems that I think will deeply ground the reality of the transjective. Because if you think problems aren't real, I don't know how you're living your life. I really don't know how you're living your life.
That's wonderful. I'll just supplement that real fast. So, you know, I'm president of the Society for Exploration of Psychotherapy Integration. My orientation or theme for the year is the common core of psychotherapy starts with what problems are. And we agree that they're entrenched maladaptive problems. Adaptive, of course, is an agent arena relational dynamic across time. Mal meaning a normative reference into it. And if you look really at all of the formulations, although they certainly emphasize inside or out often, they actually have to be brought to bear on the transjective across time.
Yes.
Amazing.
Excellent.
Okay, so let's keep moving forward then and keep tying these things, these threads together. So on that note of right, I mean the entire series is entitled Psyche-pathology and Well-being, if I remember correctly. Yes, so psyche-pathology, right? That's
you're in the right series there, Garri. That's good.
Am I in the right place? Okay. So psychepathology, right? Let's do a quick etymology of that. There's 3 words that psychopathology comes from. The first is psyche, which broadly means something like mind or soul, or if you want to make it even more phenomenological, life world, we can say. Pathos, suffering, we can say. And logos, right? The meaning or intelligibility of whatever it is. And so to do a psychopathology is to get an account of the logos of the suffering mind. And that's a very complex thing to do because human minds aren't simple. They're not basic. They're very complex. They're linguistic. They're cultural. They're historical. They're affective. They're cognitive. They're embodied. They're situated. They're worlded. All of these things have to be taken into account. How are we going to do that? We have to start simple. And so my first premise is that to get to where we want to go, we have to start with the theory of recursive relevance realization. That's going to set the first principles, so to speak, but not in a kind of dogmatic sense, but in a way that'll disclose and elucidate what's going on at the level of basic dynamics and structure when we're considering, right, the phenomenon of mindedness, of embodied mindedness. So
can I just make a quick real point just so that people that are following? So we talked about this as initially psychopathology and well-being, and then we made the shift to psyche. Yeah. And certainly then I just want us to be clear, at least when I'm using the term, psychology then is referring to the normative general. Okay, so psychology's task, for example, is to understand, say, the psychopathology of depression. And I would say that's a state of behavioral shutdown, and that would be a normative general claim about this phenomena that would then be describable across contexts. However, psyche-pathology then refers to the idiographic subject in the contingent real from the outside, from the inside out. So it is my depression. Okay. And then in that, oh, nobody's paying attention to my unified theory. And why am I in pain? And what is the architecture of that? That's not a general reality. Okay. That is my own ego manifestation in an own unique contingent real. It's not even theoretical. It's an embodied real. So for me, psyche on the inside out holds a proper relationship to the outside in of psychology. And actually those things need to be ontologically and epistemically differentiated. And I don't know that we've really done that. to set up a proper transjective. And I feel like we're situated to do that now. So I just want to make sure people catch that actually there's a fourth maybe differentiation here, psyche from psycho, and then pathology.
Yeah.
Please, John, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's excellent, and I think that's right. One of the things I've been trying to do, especially recently, and especially some of the recent work I've been doing, the talks, is to build on the idea that recursive relevance realization can help to do both, in that it can give us a universal theory of process without claiming a homogeneity of particular product, right? And so we can just, and this is exactly analogous to evolution. We can use evolution as a universal theory, but that doesn't explain how the porcupine is specifically adapted to the porcupine's ecological niche, right? Right. And so it does explain it, but it doesn't, right? But it also explains like why the porcupine is different from the shark, is different from the bat, right? So, this is properly, I think, a genuinely pluralistic ontology in which we can give a universal account of the nomological features that is consistent with the historical specific account we give of specific agent arena relationships in the world. And so for me, and that was one of the strengths I saw in the evolutionary theory, as it cuts between, a rampant relativism and a kind of perennial universalism, and tries to, I would say, using now Greg's language, tries to give us a way, almost Heraclitus, the way in and the way out are the same way, in some way.
That's a trippy dippy loop, John, of ways.
And so what I'm trying to say, and I'm trying to say carefully, and I'm afraid I'm stumbling, but this account allows us to give a unified explanation of the relationship between the two without reducing one to the other, right? Without reducing.
Totally. And I'll just say I live in a parallel universe to John, and had, with behavioral investment theory,
yes,
influence matrix, and justification, I see in these general nomenclatic, and then I see my life in relationship to investment, influence, and justification patterns, and it affords the local contingent real and the nomenclatic general process. And so, and then to hook up with that John's system, and then I think we're building a meta transjective frame here.
So to sort of connect that with the train of thought that we were on earlier, what we're going to do is start with the outside point of view, starting with the basic theory of recursive relevance realization, then move up to the outside point of view with respect to personality, structure, and function, the 5 major traits of personality. And depending on what happens afterwards, we'll either stay on the outside point of view, moving into attachment, or we'll take some time actually coming back inside and looking at the big 5 from the inside point of view, and seeing how the two connect. And that's actually what my dissertation research is on. And I'm in the middle of authoring an article with Dr. Jesse Goikachea in my department on using tools like the big 5, right, in an individualized fashion to make sense of this person here in this context, rather than making generalities and things like that. So
this was implicit, and I didn't. It just sort of leapt out to me as salient in a way I hadn't before. You two are facing this problem, like it's at the guts of what you're trying to do. You're trying to get the outside in and the inside out to mesh in an effective manner. So this is not just a theoretical problem, no pun intended. This is a deeply existential therapeutic constraint that you're always working with.
Absolutely.
Right.
It's a version of the heart problem, actually. And what we're doing is some
heart problem of the psyche.
Yeah. And what we're basically doing is a kind of neurophenomenology, except instead of comparing brain scans with like first-person descriptions of experiences, we're comparing nomethetic, right, statistical information, results and things like that about that help to classify people into types with what people say about their experiences, to hermeneutically bring these two poles together in a meaningful way, to afford change, psychological change.
So somehow integrating without reducing, right, the existential and the nomological, so that you get effective therapeutic intervention.
Totally.
Exactly.
And I would say, instead of neurophenomenological, although I deeply appreciate that view, I'd actually say, at least a UTOC view extends out and gives a behavioral phenomenological view. And it captures a big history behavioral view from the outside that's up to the task of contextualizing the psyche phenomenological view from the inside and mapping that.
And I think Greg's right. I mean, for all the respect I give to Evan, we're not just looking at neurological behavior. I mean, especially if you're embodied and embedded and enacted and extended. So Greg's totally right about that.
And I would just, at an example level, I can recognize my wife's behavior very clearly. But if you showed me a picture of her brain, I would not recognize it. I wouldn't say, "Oh, there's my wife." Okay. Anyway.
So let's start with one of the basic premises of recursive relevance realization, which is that any system that is to be in an adaptive sort of relationship with the world has to have the capacity to, on the one hand, be able to remain stable across time, and on the other hand, to be able to change across time to fit, right, changes in its environment. And so the basic premise, put slightly differently, is this: that the kind of world that we're tasked with contending with can vary on a spectrum from being highly stable versus highly dynamic. So if you live in a highly stable world,
both synchronically and diachronically, right? So when I just want to make clear that for people, it can vary from stable to highly variant diachronically, but also synchronically, because you can E equals MC squared is quite stable, but what's happening with the match as it burns is very so levels of analysis can also take you between invariance and variance. So it's both synchronic and diachronic, just to give people a rich sense of what we're talking about here.
Nice. Okay. So essentially, if we hook that up with the theory of recursive relevance realization, the two constraints, dynamical constraints that you proposed, John, alongside your co-authors, were efficiency and resiliency. Efficiency is the tendency to be very selective about what it is that you actually do and what possibilities you enact, right? So it's a selective constraint as you conceptualized it, which is put in an opponent processing relationship with resiliency, which does sort of the opposite. It enables, it affords novel possibilities.
Yes.
And it's kind of like the difference between somebody who, when they see a problem, right? Let's say it's like connect the dots from point A to point B. They're going to do a straight line versus somebody else who's going to see all these other ways of connecting the lines, right? Creating possibilities that sort of go outside of the box, in a manner of speaking.
Yes.
And people vary on their personalities and in terms of their cognition and their styles on this sort of spectrum. So anything you'd like to add before we start moving on to personality?
No, just that that's the exact analogy to biological evolution, where you have something in the brain is keeping variation alive, pun intended, right? Keeping options open, because that maintains the evolvability of the system. If the system only relentlessly pursues efficiency, it will lose the capacity for evolvability. But you don't want to vary uncontrollably, because then the system falls apart. And so the brain is constantly trying to get to that edge, the edge of criticality, the precipice of criticality that precipitates relevance, right? By constantly balancing itself there. And that's exactly what happens in evolution. You get, for various reasons, mutation and geological separation, you get variation. And then because of scarcity of resources, you get selection. And and it winnows it. So variation, and then from that selected group, a new variation, and then from that, a selected group, and so on. And that's how the species constantly is modifying its morphology, meaning both its shape and its behavior, to fit a constantly changing environment. And the proposal is your brain is doing that just very fast.
Yep.
And it has strong parallels to Piaget, right? In terms of assimilation and combination.
Which Leo Ferraro and I talked about too, in one of our publications. Assimilation is a very selective process. Accommodation is an introduction of variation. Equilibration is when there is a dynamic balance between them that is fitting the child to the environment. We did not, in a sense, it's the paper that Tim and Blake and I did, Tim Littleclap, Blake Richards, we were trying to say, like, we were explicating a lot of stuff that was already implicit in a lot of places. You can see the same thing in deep learning. It generates variations and then does compression on. A lot of things were converging on this is the core sort of thing.
So it's interesting that the point there isn't that a good system is one that does one or the other, but one that it's a good system is one that's able to do both in an optimal fashion. Because obviously there's a trade-off. If you tend more towards one pole, then you lose out on the benefits that the other would grant you, and vice versa. And so what you want to do is, when you're in a highly variable environment or world, you want to be able to keep up and cope with the changes. So you yourself want to be able to vary along with the world.
Right.
But then if you're placed in a relatively stable environment, then you don't want to be chaotic, right? You want to be able to maintain and sustain a certain mode of engagement. A certain style of expression, let's say. So that, right, in our paper, which by the way, just finally got its issue. I don't know if you were keeping track, John, but our EB5T paper, anyway, it's got a page number and it's got its own issue now. And
it's birth.
It's finally real. It's finally
real thing.
So our main claim was that process of optimization, if we conceptualize that in embodied cognitive terms, we have to think of it as a kind of optimal gripping.
Yes.
And that's what Merleau-Ponty talked about.
Yeah, totally. Totally. So
optimal gripping is what recursive relevance realization does. That's the basic claim there. Relevance RRR does optimal gripping, or is optimal gripping, something like that, when successful. So taking this, we took this notion of triple R as optimal grip, and we plugged it into the Big Five theory of personality to make the case that at the level of traits, your trait configurations, let's say, are essentially predispositions for styles of optimally gripping your world along the five major dimensions.
Oh, that's beautifully said.
Nice.
Excellent.
So maybe we can get into the trait hierarchy at this point, and
just an acknowledgement of Colins' work and how important it was to ours, Colin DeYoung's work. So Colin did a lot of the preliminary work. Gary's probably going to talk about it. I just want to flag this, sort of put a little flag. Thank you, Colin. Your work was really important and inspirational for the work we are doing.
Absolutely. So let's actually talk about Colin's contribution here, or at least insofar as it's relevant to our discussion right now. My understanding is that Colin's work has been at the cutting edge of sort of the cognitive science of personality, and also the neuroscience of personality. He's been everywhere in those domains, and it's crazy just seeing how prolific his writing has been, his work has been. So he's also one of your previous students.
TAs, yep.
TAs, right? So that's a cool connection. And essentially, before Colin came along, my understanding of it is that the Big Five theory of personality, which was, again, very well studied, very highly esteemed, and very widely used, as a way of classifying people into different types, understanding individual differences, and also being able to predict certain types of behavior on the basis of those kinds of measurable individual differences. that the Big Five theory was essentially a descriptive and predictive theory, but it wasn't explanatory.
Yeah.
In other words, although we observed that there exist these 5 major traits that people can vary along, right? We didn't know why exactly that was, or what maybe the biological or functional underpinnings of these things were.
Exactly.
Above and beyond being able to say that, given, right, that you scored at the 98th percentile on this trait, that means that you're likely going to be show up in such and such ways in such and such situations. There wasn't much to say about that. Colin changed that.
Yeah, the origin, just to understand exactly, well, where does that mean and where would that come from? So a lot branches of psychology get obsessed with empirical investigation because the theoretical stuff is such a morass. So they start looking for ways just to map territory. And one of the things that they did that ultimately roots the trait theory, Big Five trait theory, is what's called the lexical hypothesis. The lexical hypothesis is that word descriptors should show up in vocabulary, and they should be clustered together potentially. And actually what happens is they search the dictionary for adjectives, and the early statistical techniques were able to be developed to show particular kinds of patterned relations in dictionary words. And those patterned relations in dictionary words are actually the source, arguably. Certainly there are other sources, but a core source of Big Five are actually just in the empirical descriptional networks of vocabulary words. So at that level, yeah, that's not connected at all to the underlying neurocognitive mechanisms of behavior. That's just sort of the languages that people are using. And that's actually the empirical patterning that gave rise to trait theory. So that's why we're like, yeah, it doesn't really have a causal explanatory mechanistic dynamic to it. It's rather a descriptive predictive theory at an empirical level.
It's an aspirin technology.
It's an aspirin technology.
Yeah, that's my name for those kinds of things. And psychology has several aspirin.
Oh, God. Well, given that it fundamentally lacks a causal explanatory structure, John, it's basically committed to that.
I like that.
Anyway, go ahead.
So yeah, I guess could we then extend that analogy and say that Colin turned it from an aspirin technology to like an antibiotic technology or something like that?
Yeah, Colin he turns it into a causal explanatory theory, and that I think is just a tremendous move. That's why I wanted to flag.
Right.
That's just he's on our side of the tracks.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
When it comes to that.
And I guess the other important bit is that if you, because the lexical hypothesis, I remember there was another aspect to it, that the point was that it was something like, to the degree that words describe real things in the world, right? If there's anything real to be said about personality, then it's going to show up, words for personality, right? Descriptors, adjectives, things like that. They're going to show up in language and across languages, across cultures. And as far as I know, they've replicated the 5-factor structure across different sets of languages,
yes,
across different cultures and things like that. There are some problems with a couple of the traits, but that depends on several things. But for the most part, we could quite confidently say that the 5-factor structure is as universal as a universal theory of a universal psychological theory can get. So we're working with 5 universal things, right? Traits. And when we encounter universals, there's something to be said about, there's at least something to get curious about the possible adaptive functions that these universals might be fulfilling. And that's the question that Colin tried to answer with his theory, his cybernetic Big Five theory of personality.
Right.
And the point was that given that the 5 major traits of personality are human universals, we can treat them as adaptations to classes of stimuli that have been present in human cultures across evolutionary stretches of time.
Yes.
And if we do that, then what do we, sorry?
I just said a very plausible argument.
Yeah. And then the question is, if we do that, if we treat the traits as adaptations, then what do we get? And that's really the answer that he fleshed out. So do you guys want to add anything before we move on to the traits?
I'll just say,
just in case people don't know, sorry, Greg, I'll go first. Cybernetics is the study basically of feedback cycles and how mechanical systems can self-organize. It's a precursor and overlaps with dynamical systems theory, just so people are aware of that. And we became even more closely aware of that, Garri and I, when we were dealing with some of the reviewers of initial versions of our paper.
All I say is basically I followed the exact same path up the mountain in a different way. I contacted Colin DeYoung, I think it was 2013 when I first encountered Cybernetic Big Five. The interface that he developed with that and the way in which I mapped the traits onto behavioral investment theory and its emergence created almost an identical structure where I had a cybernetic feature that would then give rise to the dispositional tendencies that were structured. We may get into talking about some of those. But it was really remarkable convergent.
Oh, and I just want to note something since Greg spoke, because Greg has, which series was it, Greg? I can't remember. Was it The Elusive Eye? I think it's The Elusive Eye we did with Christopher Mastropietro. Greg wants it very clearly understood, as it should, and it very actually lines up with this argument, especially about its epistemic origins, that personality might be the wrong adjective. There are definitely these traits. I think that's indisputable. Equating them, giving them the ontological status of personality, especially now when you know how they derive, the personality literally means the property that makes you a person. And I think it's an inexcusable ontological stretch to think that these 5 traits capture personality, or what I now call personhood, and especially how they're not capturing a lot of the stuff we're talking about. We're talking about the psyche. So one of the things you have to hear, and this is some subtlety, right? These are universal in the sense they apply to all people, but they're not universal in the sense that they completely explain your personhood. That's a mistake that, and the psychologists who call it personality theory bear responsibility for that equivocation. Right? It's a bad naming. We're stuck with it because it's just pervasive. We can't do anything about it. And Greg has said a lot about it in The Elusive Eye. So do these traits exist? Undeniable. Do they capture the essence of your personhood? Very deniable. Very deniable. And so try to keep those two. Just because something is universal doesn't mean it's complete, right? So just put that keep that warning in mind. None of us are going to be talking about these traits that I don't equate them with personality, right? Or if they're equated to personality, then I want another term like personhood. I don't know what people want to do with that. I'm not trying to dictate semantic policy. I just want it to be clear that people generally overread what these traits are. So just wanted to say that. And again, I point you to The Elusive Eye, where we talked about that in great detail.
That's great. Greg, did you want to add something to that?
Yes, just traits are one thing, personality is different. Okay? Yeah. You can know what your trait profile is. That's useful. That is not who you are. And for historical reasons, the term personality gets conflated and confounded with traits. And we see, oh, the personality theory is trait theory, horribly erroneous at multiple levels.
Yeah, I really like that. I would actually extend that. I might actually extend that into a deeper critique and say that anything about you is not who you are. There's something about you, right? That's inexhaustible and irreducible to anything that can be said about you. And any of these assessment instruments or tools, they're going to be making, right? They're going to be sampling aspects of you. At best, and this is just one way of doing that, the Big Five. And maybe this is also one of the gaps that the process of individualizing assessment findings tries to bridge. How can we use these kinds of finite, right, instruments of measuring certain aspects of you and compare, right, ways of comparing you to others to get a better sense of who you are in certain contexts? But okay, so going back on track, right? We're trying to link recursive relevance realization with the Big Five theory of personality. At this point, let's go over the 5 traits briefly, and then the 2 meta traits, and then maybe the 10 aspects. So the 5 traits, there's a helpful acronym, or there's 2 helpful acronyms to remember them by. One of them is OCEAN. The other one is CANOE. I favor CANOE because the way it looks, it actually helps you to group the traits better under the meta traits.
Yeah.
So with Canoe, right, you've got conscientiousness, agreeableness, and neuroticism on the one hand, and openness and extroversion on the other. Conscientiousness is essentially a measure of how orderly and industrious you are. Let's say you are very high in conscientiousness, you walk into a room and you see that there's a lot of clutter on the floor. You're gonna get triggered. You're gonna be like, things are out of place. They need to be put back where they belong. And then as you find yourself, right, trying to put everything back into place, you remember that you had an appointment. So you quickly check your time and your agenda, and you're like, I gotta get on track. So for the person who's high in conscientiousness, the future is very present, right? The future is very present. And I think we'll talk about how this relates to inaction and recursive relevance realization in a bit. But first, let's go through the traits. Then you've got trait agreeableness, right? Which has to do with how you like to, right? It's compassion and politeness. Those are the two basic aspects of it. Compassion is, it describes how likely you are to like feel for another person, take their perspective, feel empathy, and relate and bond with them. And politeness describes how you can hold back any aggressive urges or impulses that you might have. Someone might say something that you didn't like to hear, and then you'll just bite your lip. That sort of or holding the door for others, or yielding a lot of the time. That's agreeableness. And measuring low on agreeableness is really just the opposite of those things. You can come off as rude or arrogant, not very thoughtful or caring towards others. Then you have trait neuroticism, which is a measure of one easy way to think about it is negative emotionality. If you're high on neuroticism, you tend to get anxious, and you tend to be moody, for example. From situation to situation, things might trigger you, and you have a kind of volatile style of expressing your emotions. If you're low on trait neuroticism, then you're relatively laid back and not easily perturbed. They say that the low end of neuroticism is just emotional stability, so that sort of speaks for itself.
Just to be clear, there's only a very tenuous relationship between neuroticism and the Big Five and Freud's understanding of that term. There's a historical connection, but it's definitely not an identity relation. So don't confuse those together.
Thank you for that. Yep. Okay, so then you've got the two remaining traits, openness and extroversion. Trait openness is the way Colin talks about it. It's your sensitivity to the incentive reward value of semantic information. That's the technical definition. What that means is you like to have intellectual conversations. You like to talk about ideas. You like to think through things a lot. You're imaginative. You like to listen to music. You enjoy novelty, right? You enjoy, right, cultural experiences. You enjoy going to museums. You enjoy thinking about things, and you're sort of heady and imaginative if you're high on trait openness. If you're not, then you tend to be more conventional in your thinking style and more down to earth. You stick to what you know. If you recall that basic example of, right, connecting point A with point B, you're just going to find a straight line to point B. And you can see how both of these can be adaptive in different contexts, of course. Like, for example, if you're performing open heart surgery, you don't want to improvise. You want to stick to what works, right? But on the other hand, if you're in science, you want to be innovative. You don't want to stick to just what works. You really want to explore. And you can think of the last trait extroversion, as the sort of concrete or behavioral version of openness. It speaks to your propensity or proclivity to exploratory behavior. So people who are extroverts, they tend to be more opportunistic. They tend to be more enthusiastic, excitable. When they hear that there's a party happening next door, their initial reaction is going to be, that sounds like fun, let's go. Why is that their reaction? Because they're actually attuned to the possible opportunities that lie in that situation. And that's what they're going to seek out, which means that if you're low on trait extroversion, and if you hear something like there's a party going on next door, you're not going to be as excited about all the positive possibilities that are actually inherent in the situation. You're going to be a little more indifferent. So together, the idea is that these 5 traits, they give not an exhaustive, but a kind of comprehensive account of the different, first of all, the different ways in which you're likely to act, but more than that, the different ways in which you're likely to act with respect to certain domains of experience. Mm-hmm. And that's where it starts to get a little more thematized, right? With neuroticism, it's the problem of threat. How do I cope with threat in the world? Am I going to fight or am I going to flee? Let's say. With extroversion, it's the problem of reward. How do I want to position and orient myself with respect to possible rewards in the world? Every time I see a possible reward, do I just want to pursue it or do I want to hold back? What's the right answer? There really isn't one. The right answer, right? It's a moving target, but people aren't infinitely flexible. They have to be predisposed to some sets of strategies more than others that will work at least enough of the time, right? And the same sort of logic, the opponent processing logic, applies to the other traits as well. We've got conscientiousness, which has to do with ordering and organizing and prioritizing goals across different time scales. Do I want to care about what I want to, do I want to care about the future I want to have, or do I want to care about what's in the here and now?
Yep.
Essentially. With trait agreeableness, do I want to care more about what other people want and need, or do I want to care more about what I want and need? Mm-hmm. Let's say. With trait openness, do I want to care about what, right, novel information and new ways of looking at things, even if that means not actually being successful with my approach or strategy? Or do I want to just stick to what I already know, given that I might be missing out on possible rewards that might be there, were I to go outside of my box, let's say, and I'm missing something? Conscientious, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness. No, I covered all of them. Do you want to add anything before we go up to the meta trait level?
No, I just noting how each one is, when you state it the way you did, Garri, there's an implicit opponent processing in there in some fashion. I just want to add for neuroticism, we now talk about, well, at least I'm trying to encourage people to talk about 3 Fs. It's fight or flee or freeze. And I think that's relevant to psychotherapy, fight or flee or freeze, right? Because freeze is a biological strategy. You see it in a lot of prey animals. They'll often, their preferred strategy is often freezing rather than fighting or fleeing, because most predators track motion, things like that. So I just wanted to just throw that into just put the 3 Fs into the neuroticism.
Yep. That's great. Greg, yep.
I mean, there's a lot that I can say. I'm not sure exactly when, but yeah, I certainly did a fair amount of work on this that I may enrich in this relationship a little bit. In particular, I'm going to invite us, when we reflect at whatever time, to consider this from an evolutionary phylogenetic perspective of layering of behavioral investment tendencies, and that's going to organize the structure in a particular kind of way that may be useful.
Excellent. I've been anticipating that actually and looking forward to it. Let's just cover the meta traits now then, and then move into that. I think that'll lay the ground for connecting triple R with what we're talking about with personality very well. And then when you fill in the phylogenetic dimension there, that'll enrich it in just the way you're saying it. So for a while, we were working with the 5-factor structure of personality. And eventually they found weak but reliable correlations between, as I mentioned earlier, the first 3 traits, conscientiousness, agreeableness, and neuroticism on the one hand, and also the second group, right, of openness and extroversion. And they inferred on that basis 2 higher order factors, which they referred to as meta trait stability and meta trait plasticity. Mm-hmm. Now it must be getting clear how this ties back to the basic premise of recursive relevance realization, that the world with which we're contending, it varies, right, on a continuum of highly static or stable and highly dynamic or even entropic. And so any adaptive organism that's to realize relevance recursively must be equipped with the basic capacities to, right, adapt to each of these poles, irrespective of the other. And the idea here, right, this was one of our main insights in the paper, that you see triple R happening at the level of personality between the meta traits, stability and plasticity, right? Stability, which includes conscientiousness, agreeableness, and neuroticism, allows you to fit yourself in a, right? It's a selective constraint. It improves or enhances stability, stable modes of engagement over time. It's something like that. Versus plasticity, which is, it's the exploratory impulse manifests at the level of personality. With respect to openness, right? It's exploration of information and novelty of, right, thoughts, ideas, things like that. And extroversion, it's behavioral exploration. That's how Colin also talked about it. And so a personality that's optimally gripping, right, between stability and plasticity is realizing what's relevant in the world that it's situated. That was the main claim that we made. And then here's the last thing I'll say, and let's get into the phylogenetic question, that individual differences in personality, therefore, are essentially differences in the manners of optimal gripping, right, that people are predisposed to with respect to their particular worlds. And so I thought that was cool. I thought that was cool because it situates personality within embodied cognition, and it demonstrates the continuity between personality and cognition as well, or embodied cognition. And I think that's useful, especially for psychotherapy. So
yeah, it puts personality traits back into a problem-solving framework, and therefore connects it, makes deeper connections between traits and intelligence. It's just we're talking at a different longitudinal scale than we are when we're talking about, like, for about fluid cognition. A couple things. So stability basically exploits invariance, and plasticity basically explores variance, and that's how you can think about it. And notice that, as Garri was describing, there is no absolute solution to all these opponent processing, and various styles are going to work. We're going to work comparatively well or worse during different kinds of environment. So if you're very high in stability, you're going to really thrive in a stable environment. You're very high in stability, you're going to really be challenged with an environment that's in flux, etc. So this also maps onto what's called the no free lunch theorem. No one personality, no one, again, I dislike using this term, but we're forced just because of language. No one personality structure is the right one. That's first of all to realize. Secondly, there's an implication about the relationship between individual and distributed cognition. Having a wide variation of styles of optimal grip within a population actually allows distributed cognition, right, to get a more comprehensive optimal grip on its environment. So, right, if you have people that are more stable and people that are more plastic, they are going to play off against each other, also with variation and invariance, in a way that's going to give distributed cognition tremendous power to fit the group, the population, to the environment. So it also links individual cognition to distributed cognition. It helps to explain both the functionality of personality within the individual and also between individuals within distributed cognition. So like, this is a theory that is trying to give, like, a lot of explanatory depth to the traits.
Lovely. So we can definitely see this intersection then between a dynamic conception, the cybernetic conception, and then this cybernetic conception informed by a recursive relevance realization that places the agent arena relationship in a structured way, and then navigating the conservative elements of control relative to the expenditure and exploratory elements that then require some sort of plastic and then enable the individual to accommodate to new possibilities, to use a Piaget term. And behavioral investment theory actually comes at the variation, selection, and retention through Skinner, just from the outside, and basically says that the environment affords a wide variety of different affordances that the animal is going to expend work effort towards and then get a return on its investment. Okay, and then anchored to all that operant conditioning research, and then arguing that there's a cybernetic, neurocognitive cybernetic system that's regulating that. Okay, and then it places that in the emergent evolutionary framework, the big history framework afforded by the tree of knowledge system, and says that what's happening with animals is that they're emerging out of complex adaptive biological systems that then are afforded an opportunity for a new vector of behavior, i.e. the behavior of the animal as a whole. And then it has to navigate the movement of the animal as a whole. And that's expensive and risky. Okay, so all actions are expensive and risky. And at the same time, they afford you to acquire various elements. Okay, and so you then have to engage in what would be arguably the emergence of the principle of least effort relative to return on that effort. And that's actually the first principle of behavioral investment theory, which is a principle of energy economics, whereby you're basically going to expend effort to acquire resources, but do so with a minimization of risk and cost relative to anticipated threat, okay, and other opportunities. So what does that give? It basically gives a gas and brake system. Gas toward the good, brake away from the bad, okay? And then the management of the breaking away from the bad is freeze, don't do anything, escape or fight if need be, or pursue a prey, pursue a mate, and pursue a territory, okay? So if we place an animal in this particular way, and if we go back to some of John's and my conversation, there's going to be valence assessment, positive, negative valence assessment, and then positive and negative balance systems that are going to be gassing toward the good and breaking away from the bad. Okay? If we structure that in the basic agent arena relationship, where the Cambrian explosion happens 520 million years ago, and you get prey predation relations as well as mate competition relations, that's what happens in the early animal phase. You now have these movement systems that are moving around and having to navigate the other around get prey and avoid being preyed upon, okay? And the argument then is that what emerges then is a positive and negative affect system embedded in a pleasure plane jolting system. And what that would then say is that, well, the way you described extroversion and neuroticism at the ground of the animal level can be then framed as the emergence of a regulatory negative affect system that's a checking out threat, managing the 3 Fs of freeze, flight, and fight, okay? And an extroverted system that's engaging in behavioral activation to seek reward, to expand plastic-wise.
Managing the fourth F?
Yeah, finding the 4th F. Feeding, and well, maybe a 5th F.
Fifth F.
Fornication. All sorts of Fs, okay? But yeah, so now you got to go pursue the food and the other F, okay? And manage the territory. We'll have to come up with an F for, territory acquisition. But fundamentally, you get this dialectical balance, right, of pushing the horizon exploratory outward to acquire, and then regulatory threat. And that then places the neuroticism and extroversion in exactly this dynamic relationship that we've talked about and is framed by recursive relevance realization in the context of the emergent animal, okay?
So is that the origin of stability and plasticity at the level of traits, would you say?
That's what I would say. I would say, I'd say nature solves this dialectic through the emergence of neuroticism in animals and a sense of threat, okay, to manage and control conservatively, and extroversion in animals to manage exploration, plasticity, and engagement. That's what I would say. And I would say you could see this in fish. All right. But what you don't really see in fish is agreeableness. Okay. Why not? Because actually fish are not terribly social creatures. All right. They herd in schools, but they don't hang out with each other. They don't parrot, and they don't create long bonds. Okay. Now, wolves and primates do. okay? And I would argue you now see emergence of this other trait, agreeableness, in this dimension. And this is actually where I'm going to actually find a little bit of potential disagreement, okay, at least for the lens of the unified theory, which is this agreeableness dimension, okay, is going to be least specifiable through precisely the exploration plasticity versus conservation dynamic. And I can explain why, but actually the self-other dynamics that emerge to give rise to the pattern behavior of agreeableness are actually embedded in both exploration and conservation. And actually the influence matrix is going to map that dynamic, and it's going to say the dispositional tendencies towards other-oriented or self-oriented will be the predominant strategies, okay, compassion and style, okay, but actually both of those in different contexts may be exploratory or conservative, all right? We can dialogue, so it will be the least clear that agreeableness, might be my prediction, the least clear dimension around this that would be effectively divided will be agreeableness, okay? And then the last thing I'll say is the person dimension, okay? The human person evolves into a cultured context, which it must be socialized into, all right? And I would then argue that conscientiousness and openness serve exactly as this structure in relationship to navigating the complex dynamics of culture, as it were, whereby conscientiousness is the internalization of achievement standards across time to conservatively manage the control of resources and achieve orderly in relationship to that. Okay, so you get a core achievement ordered dynamic that conservatively organizes the structure and internalizes it. So you get connections to like the super ego and your conscientiousness, okay, right, which is internalizing standards that are good that you can then know will exist across time and then order, and then explore the rim of culture, become high cultured, look into the possibilities of feelings of novelty, of exploration. So then the openness culture dimension, conscientious dimension at the person level, human person level, becomes exactly, once again, this plasticity, resilient dynamic there. So for me, I see the animal level, I see the primate level at the influence matrix, and that gets complicated. And then I see the person dimension being well captured by the conscientiousness openness.
Could I jump on that for a moment, John? I don't know if you have thoughts, but I really want to jump on this because it's interesting how you said that conscientiousness and openness are sort of the proper traits of right, of like socialized human beings, let's say, of modern human beings, because as our social structures complexify, the demands, right, on how to coordinate ourselves together in large groups, they get more and more demanding, in other words. And so I was just thinking about if conscientiousness is sort of the strategy or the strategy that we use to improve our coordination capacities with one another across timescales, then I was just thinking about how culturally the experience of time over time changed from, John, you've talked about this, from kairos to chronos, actually.
Yes.
Because, right, our phenomenological sense of time as it's lived, it's not chronological, objectively measurable time. It's timing, right? It's our actions in relation to events in the world in order to optimally grip, for example. But we can't just have that sense of time as lived if we want to live in the modern world. We have to be able to coordinate ourselves with each other across larger, right, longer time scales.
Yes.
And that's sort of what chronos, chronological or objectively measurable linear time is really about. And it sounds like, to me, I see a relationship there between the evolution of conscientiousness and the cultural cognitive achievement of time as objectively measured and linear.
So before numeracy, way before numeracy, way before literacy, we have calendrics. The use of calendars appears in the upper Paleolithic transition. And it is one of the first things we try to do, one of the first powerful psychotechnologies we do, is we try to standardize time. And it seems to go, it is coordinating, it's co-emerging with the cognitive complexification of the upper Paleolithic transition, which is plausibly connected to the complexification of trade networks and of the social demands and pursuing more long-term goals. I think that's exactly right. Yeah, and I think Greg's proposal about conscientiousness and openness, at least as the traits are standardly defined. I mean, Greg, there of course there's precursors at the animals levels. There's like the delayed gratification for long-term goals, even amongst animals, curiosity, even among animals. So 100%. There's an acceptation process happening.
Totally. Yeah. All I would say is that the dimension of expanded cognition across time, symbolic networking across in the intersubjective, and then the propositional network and the evolution of culture, as the launches us into this new dimension of complexification. And the prediction is pretty clear, and I would argue we see it, that we should in animals be able to see extroversion, neuroticism, and agreeableness in social mammals with a pretty high degree of specificity, reliability as behavior patterns. Conscientiousness and openness in animals should be significantly less reliable in terms of its capacity to detect them, because they're more mapping onto these more human person cultured traits in relationship to the extension across time, the justification dynamics around socialization, and the ordering of that internalization from a conscientiousness perspective, and the desire to explore and engage in it. So it just gets absolutely, we're taking dispositional tendencies by definition. If we take recursive relevance, behavioral investment seriously, this goes to the core of cognition, these dynamics. So we're going to see precursors, but they're going to take on their own features so that conscientiousness and openness, I mean, take openness. Openness still is one of the hardest traits of all the traits, it's hardest to define. I would argue it has the least, it's valid, but it has the least robust specificity. And its characterization in animals, apart from just curiosity and exploration, which you can get a lot out of in terms of just extroversion, it's a very, very, it dissipates in terms of what we're actually grabbing a hold of at the animal level. At least
I was thinking of tool construction as perhaps one of the markers at the animal level of openness.
That'd be a really interesting one.
And so there's precursors there at that level.
Definitely precursors. It just, but the precursors with, I had a really neurotic dog. I mean, and people know what I mean by that. Very, reactive, irritable at times, very, very nervous. Those kinds of issues. That's not hard to see in the mammal kingdom.
Right. That's cool. That's good. So the issue around agreeableness is you think it shows both plasticity and stability aspects to it?
Well, I mean, basically, to me, then, of course, I built the influence matrix, right? Which now, John, I would basically argue is, what I was mapping was recursive relevance realization in relation.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, and your theory is a bioeconomic model, and so is recursive relevance realization at its core. Totally.
So then you get then what the influence matrix does, it says, us as human primates are tracking the self-other dimension. It maps the specificity of it, and then says there's a core dimension about whether or not you're going to be other-oriented, which is going to have a motivational element that's compassion, okay, and then a stylistic element that's tender-minded or polite. Okay, and then you're going to have, or the reverse, disagreeableness. You're going to either lacking compassion or be grumpy interpersonally. And those are, if you're going to then extract the most general patterns of tendency of the self-other or other self orientation, that's what it says. Now, then if we want to put that into plasticity, resiliency dynamics, okay, I think the trait's just capturing self over other versus other over self tendencies, which is going to then, we can put that in to say, okay, yes, you're going to want to get along with the environment. Okay. So I can certainly see why we would put agreeableness along with neuroticism and conscientiousness. Okay. And I would certainly guess that it would organize that way. But at the same time, when you really look at the specific dynamics of what it's getting at, the others live in opponent process. Conscientiousness lives against openness, and extroversion lives against neuroticism. Agreeableness, disagreeableness then may live in relationship to each other, and it's defined by a self-other dynamic that isn't quite as specifiable as the just agent arena exploration dynamic. And as a function of that, there are going to be other layers that need to be disentangled to get the clear relation. But certainly inside of agreeableness, there absolutely is going to be this recursive relevance realization dynamic of plasticity, resilience, or exploration and consideration.
Because that's part of the argument we made, actually. that each one of the traits, not just agreeableness, but each one of the traits, because of recursive relevance realization in terms of the subtraits, also has a stability plasticity play.
Definitely. And they would, but at the macroscopic level, at least what I'm arguing is there's an animal dimension here at neuroticism extroversion. There's a person dimension here. And then there's this primate dimension that inside of this, we'd have to disentangle this self-other dynamic that would afford more layering inside of agreeableness than inside the others.
I see what you're saying. So maybe there's like two things to tease apart here. One of them is that within trait agreeableness, the kind of opponent processing that's happening is with respect to the higher order goal of social harmony. Reduce social conflict. That's sort of the telos or the normativity of that trait, if we were to make a claim like that, the way I see it. Especially from this cybernetic big five theory perspective, right? And EB5T takes that on for itself. And the way that's done is through the opponent processing of compassion, right? Which enables pro-social possibilities, right? Through bonding and compassion and empathy. And politeness, which eliminates or reduces antisocial possibilities. And the higher you are on trait agreeableness, the more your tendency toward social harmony. The lower you are, the further your tendency from social harmony. That was the telos. But you're also talking about, I think what I would say, if I were to guess actually, that you're talking about is the kind of normativity that emerges out of a relationship, right? When you get something like participatory sense making, John, maybe you can like pitch in here and elaborate a little bit on this.
Well, I have a proposal about this. I think there might be a way of stitching these together with our, I mean, Greg might be onto something. I'm not sure. I'm sure that Greg is probably onto something because he's always onto something, but I mean, I'm not sure about what I think about it yet. So
am I onto something there?
Because we talked about, there should be an aspect of this theory that is mediating between individuation and participation, between individual cognition and group cognition, between individual cognition and distributed cognition. That's part of the theory. And if I understand Greg right, that might be, so I do think what you're saying is also the case. Agreeableness is showing the recursive relevance realization machinery, but it might have this dimension of relating individual cognition to distributed cognition that isn't as pronounced in the other traits. And so you could see it as an intersection, if you'll allow me a graph of sort of relevance realization machinery, but also individuation participation machinery. And that would help, I think that would actually resolve the tension between the two claims. I'm proposing that right now.
And I'm making an empirical prediction. I don't really know this, you guys may, but in terms of the factor loading structure, okay, I would certainly make the prediction that O and E are loading more clearly, and N and C are loading more clearly, and A should load the least clear in relationship to the macroscopic structure.
That's something we could just check out.
You can just check. That's an empirical prediction that falls immediately out of the argument.
Yep, we should definitely do that. I mean, either result would be interesting, right? That's what makes it a good empirical prediction. If you're wrong, Greg, then that means some adjustment has to be made. If you're right, then that would lend credence to what I'm proposing, that we should see at least one trait trying to manage the optimal grip between individual and group and distributed cognition. The self-other, as you put it, Greg, that would be an important dimension that needs to be in this theory. I mean, Garri, we're kind of bound to that as an entailment. There has to be something, because we talk about this working at individual cognition and distributed cognition, but we actually need something that is performing the optimal grip between those two, between self and other.
So what I'm hearing right now is that maybe what agreeableness is doing isn't helping you to prioritize other people's goals over your own, but to prioritize the norms of the relationships themselves. I'm not doing this for just you, but for the sake of our relationship.
Yes, I think
there's a kind of
that you can think about. I'm almost the metaphor that's coming, and don't push the metaphor too hard because it's an initial metaphor. But agreeableness is like an interface function, and think about where the word interface comes from. Like think about facing each other, right? And so that's very powerful. Like I say, first of all, this is genuine dialogos, something's emerging here. And I think, and like I said, I think Greg has done the really responsible thing. He's made an empirical prediction, and if there's confirmation of it, I think this theoretical proposal needs to be made and needs to be sort of, well, put in somewhere. Obviously, we can't do it in the thing that's not published, but we could do it going forward. That makes sense to me. And like I said, our argument entails that there is such a function somewhere. There has to be.
Lovely. Yeah, I'd love to flesh this out and see where the details are. I mean, I think we're certainly starting on such an outline. Like I said, I'll make the prediction in that regard, see if that unfolds.
Yeah.
And just have people think about it in terms of, to me, if I think exploration and conservation, extroversion and neuroticism fall very clearly. Openness and conscientiousness fall very clearly. The concept of agreeableness or disagreeableness falls a lot less clear, at least at a semantic level. That's one way, another way of framing that. But yeah, this is let's deconstruct this at some level. That'd be really fascinating.
Well, usually when there's lack of clarity, it's because there's confounding variables, and that's what I'm proposing.
Exactly. Right. No, I'm in total agreement with you. That's and the influence matrix. That's what it maps. It's sort of like, hey, there's a self-other recursive relevance realization dynamic that's embedded in this that has to be layered on top of it to gain clarity about what these things are.
Right. This is cool. And a good theory should be doing this at all times. Excellent.
I have some thoughts on this, and maybe we can link this to attachment theory next time. But I know we don't have too much time left.
Yeah, we should be wrapping up. We should be wrapping this up.
Yeah. Let me make just one or two more claims about how this links to the question of psyche-pathology and well-being, because we've been talking about how recursive relevance realization as optimal gripping is at the core of personality when taken up from the trait perspective, right? You see relevance realization taking place within the traits. We didn't elaborate on that today, but for anyone who's interested, just read the paper or look at the or whatever. So we've got recursive relevance realization happening within the traits, and then we've got it happening at the metatrait level between the metatrait stability and plasticity. And recursive relevance realization itself gives us a criterion of the normative. That's the argument here, that when the situation that you're contending with, right, when your traits meet the demands of the situation that you're contending with, you're in an optimally gripping relationship with your world. But when situational demands exceed, right, the capacity of your traits to adapt or cope with such situational variables or conditions, then you lose your optimal grip and your fittedness to the world. And so there's an interesting way to apply this to psychological assessment, actually, which is sort of what I'm exploring right now, which is you start by literally asking people, what is it that brings you here, right? What's your presenting concern, in other words? And usually it's not something like I had a bad day. It's more like I've been having many bad days. And there's been some sort of thematic thread weaving through and tying together all the bad days that they've been having, whether it's been disagreements with other people or problems with their mood or uncertainty and anxiety around the future or what have you. Then the question is, if you can find what's thematic, right, in their descriptions of what their problem is, then maybe that could implicate a trait situation breakdown that's happening, a suboptimal gripping that's happening at the level of traits. Because what traits describe is styles or patterns of thinking, feeling, behaving, et cetera, across longer time scales. And so if the kinds of problems that patients are dealing with, that they bring into the therapy room, are problems taking place at longer time scales, and if traits are descriptions of patterns of behavior and cognition and feeling that take place across longer time scales, then you should expect there to be a strong relationship between the two. You could use the Big Five to assess for breakdowns in person situation that might be implicated in why people are struggling with what they're struggling with. And that leads into the question of Well, it's a construct that we sort of just named in our paper, but that I'm going to be elaborating on in the next one, world enactment, right? And let me say this too, and I'll conclude my part. But, when we think of personality traits, we think of properties that are intrinsic to the person. You have this trait inside of you, right? You've got this amount of extroversion inside of you, or this amount of conscientiousness inside of you. But that's not the inactivist way of taking it up at all. And it's also not at all the way traits show themselves in our lives. Traits are world involving. You can't have trait extroversion except in relation to possible rewards in the world in which you're embedded, in which you're situated. You can't have trait openness if there's nothing to think about, if there's nothing to imagine. You can't have trait neuroticism if there's nothing to worry about or to fear or to be anxious about. So traits are fundamentally world involving. And so the phenomenological hypothesis here is that if you want to know who a person is, don't look at their trait measures only. Turn to their world. What's the kind of world that they're inhabiting? What's the kind of world that's being enacted, brought forth, lived in, experienced, that's being participated in? And so the whole question is, how can we think of traits as denoting styles of world enactment?
Yes.
Love it.
Yes.
Good.
Yes.
So maybe we could explore some of that next time before we get into attachment theory.
I think that's excellent. And I think that goes right back to what we said at the very beginning about the ontology of problems as being inherently transjective. I think of the traits, the way you're describing them, as longitudinal constraints on the problem space for people. And the problem space is always co-created by the individual and the environment in which they are within. So I think this is a great place to bring it to close. Does anybody have any final words they want to say before I press the stop button?
No, I think that's a really nice summary, Garri, and I think that's an excellent also bridge to set us up both to continue this sort of transjective analysis, and then to set us up to attachment theory, which fundamentally is going to be a self-other participatory dance structure.
Exactly. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank
Great
you.
dialogos. Great argument. Great logos and dialogos.